The Devoe Chair Professor at Florida State University has been at FSU for nearly 30 years, is one of the great economics professors, fiscal libertarian conservatives on issues that are important to us related to tax and budget issues. Randy has been a senior fellow with JMI since our founding in 1987. He has provided hundreds of hours, hundreds of times before state committees, state legislature, various committee testimonies, and has also testified at the national level on numerous budgetary issues. Just this past legislative session, Randy spent a lot of time at the Capitol as a JMI Senior Fellow talking about reducing the cost of government, not raising taxes. We all know that when it comes to government, it is rarely a revenue problem and almost always a spending problem. And Randy spent a lot of time up there. He has produced 2 studies just this year alone for the Institute. One on tax and budget issues, the economic road to recovery for Florida, and also one on some public-private partnerships as it relates to the management of state lands. The state of Florida owns millions and millions of acres that are simply going to seed, literally and figuratively. And JMI takes the position if you outsource the privatization, if you privatize the management of those lands will be better protected. So Randy spent a lot of time at the Capitol there. He has been appointed to numerous committees, served on Governor Bush's economic advisory team. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Randy Holcombe.
Thanks very much, Bob. Thanks for that nice introduction. I am delighted to be here. What I'm going to focus on in my talk are national issues, because so much has happened in the past year. Really, we're at a crossroads in our national economy right now. Policy has changed so much in the past year that it's easy to envision that we're on the cusp of changes that could have an impact as big as the changes that we saw during the New Deal. I'm going to talk about 4 specific areas of federal policy today. First of all, I'm going to talk about the Federal Reserve and changes in Federal Reserve policy that we've seen. Second of all, I'm going to talk about TARP, the Toxic Asset Relief Program that was put in place during the Bush administration. Third, I'm going to talk about President Obama's stimulus package. And fourth, I'm going to talk about the bailouts. And the message I'm going to bring to you is a message of hope and change. The change, well, I've already told you what those changes are. I'm going to talk about them in more detail. And the hope, what I'm hoping is these don't turn out to be as monumental as it looks like they're likely to be. Let me start talking about changes in Federal Reserve policy. The Federal Reserve is a pretty obscure institution, and I think not that many people have that good of an idea about what the Federal Reserve actually does. But since its inception, the purpose of the Federal Reserve Bank has been, well, it was actually founded to make loans to member banks who are members of the Federal Reserve System, make collateralized loans when those banks have liquidity problems. Since then, it's taken over more of the management of our money supply. But in the history of the Federal Reserve Bank, up until this past year, the Federal Reserve Bank only has made loans to banks who are members of the Federal Reserve System. That's changed over the past year or so as the Federal Reserve Bank has started making loans to other financial institutions that not only aren't members of the Federal Reserve System, but aren't banks, other non-bank financial institutions. This has never happened before in the history of the Federal Reserve. And it's troubling to see it happen, because when the Federal Reserve gets in that position of choosing that it's going to lend money to some institutions rather than others, it gets in the policy of picking winners and losers. It can support some firms, doesn't have to support other firms. Similarly, throughout the history of the Federal Reserve Bank, in its control of the money supply in what's known as open market operations, the Federal Reserve Bank has always undertaken those operations by buying and selling government securities. That's one of its main functions in controlling the money supply. I won't get into too many details about how that works, but essentially it's by buying and selling government securities. The Federal Reserve controls the size of the money supply. When you hear on the news about the Fed is going to raise interest rates or lower interest rates or something like that, it's doing that through open market operations by buying and selling government securities. In the past year, it's started buying other securities, not federal government securities. This has never happened before. It's unprecedented in the history of the Federal Reserve System. So what we're seeing now in these two changes that we've seen in the Federal Reserve Bank operations, instead of being a neutral determiner of monetary policy, of money growth and of interest rates, it's picking particular firms, it's picking particular investments. So it buys particular securities, supports those investors, doesn't buy other securities, so it's not supporting those investors. It's investing in particular non-bank financial firms, which it's never done before. Most spectacularly, of course, the Federal Reserve Bank took over AIG, so now it's the majority owner of AIG. Again, the Federal Reserve Bank has never done anything like this before. It's a major change in Federal Reserve Bank policy. I don't see it written about very much, if at all. I mean, I think it's escaped the financial news media, maybe partly because they don't really understand the role in the operations of the Federal Reserve. It's very troubling to see the Federal Reserve get so intimately involved in the details of the economy and picking particular firms and particular investments to support or not support. Essentially, the Federal Reserve has transformed itself in the last year so that now, in addition to controlling the money supply, it's also operating industrial policy. It's choosing which sectors of the economy to invest in, which firms of the economy to invest in. It's reminiscent of what happened in Japan in the early 1990s. Japan had a similar situation. They had a real estate bubble, also a stock market bubble. When real estate prices and stock prices collapsed, a lot of Japanese banks found themselves in financial trouble. Rather than allowing insolvent banks to go out of business, Japan got involved in supporting those financial institutions. The Japanese economy has stagnated ever since. In the 1980s, it was a rapidly growing economy. From the 1990s on to the present day, we've seen a stagnating Japanese economy. Part of this, I think, we have to hang on that Japanese industrial policy that's had not allowed failing firms to fail and to allow successful firms to prosper. And we're seeing the Federal Reserve Bank get involved in that same type of industrial policy. So it's quite troubling. The second thing I want to talk about is the Tarp Program. Now, you probably remember back in September when Secretary Paulson announced this toxic asset relief program. He said it's an emergency. Right now, we need to get these toxic assets off the balance sheets of these banks. And so he essentially bullied Congress into passing that Tarp program that gave him $700 billion so that at his discretion, he could use that money to buy up these toxic assets. That's what he said we needed to do. That was the emergency. Congress approved the $700 billion to be spent essentially at the discretion of the Secretary of the Treasury, but it never was used to buy those toxic assets. I mean, that was the justification. That's why we needed to do something in an emergency in such a hurry, but yet that's not what happened. Instead, what happened is that TARP money has been used to allow the federal government to take equity interest in banks. So instead of soaking up those toxic assets, as Secretary Paulson said was so necessary, instead that money has been used to